Sarah, we've decided you're going to give Emma your Mustang. My mother's voice cut through the Sunday dinner conversation with the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no in her life, and I felt my fork freeze halfway to my mouth as the words registered. This was October, 6 years after I'd moved out of my parents' house in Naperville and built a life for myself in Chicago. 6 years of Sunday dinners where I'd tried to maintain some connection to my family, despite the patterns I'd started to recognize. And now here we sat in the formal dining room with its cream-colored walls and the china that only came out for family meals. And Mom was telling me to hand over the most valuable thing I owned. Not asking, telling. My sister Emma sat across from me, 25 years old and newly divorced. Her blonde hair perfectly curled in that effortless way that had always come naturally to her. And I watched her face light up with an excitement that made my stomach turn, because she didn't even pretend to be surprised by this announcement, which meant they'd discussed it before I arrived, had planned this moment, had decided together that my property was theirs to redistribute. "The Mustang?" I managed to say, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how immediately I fell back into the role of the compliant daughter, the one who didn't make waves, the one who sacrificed so that Emma could have whatever she wanted. The car sitting in my apartment building's secured garage in Lincoln Park wasn't just a car, though I knew that explaining this to my mother would be pointless because she'd never understood the hours I'd spent rebuilding it. The 3 years of weekends and evenings and every spare moment I could find. The way I'd bought it as a rusted shell for $8,000 and poured $22,000 more into parts and paint, and the education I'd given myself through YouTube videos and forums, and the patience of the old man who ran the auto shop 2 blocks from my apartment. I was 28 years old, a marketing director at Morrison Marketing, with a salary of $95,000 a year that my family dismissed as just marketing, as if my work was somehow less real than a traditional career, and that Mustang represented every hour I'd worked to become independent, to build something with my own hands that nobody could take credit for, to prove to myself that I was capable of more than the limited role my family had assigned me. "Emma needs reliable transportation," Mom continued, cutting her pot roast with precise movements, not even looking at me as she dismantled my life. "She has job interviews coming up, and she can't keep borrowing my car." I thought about pointing out that Emma had been living back at home for 4 months since her divorce, that Mom's 2019 SUV sat in their driveway most days, that there were a dozen solutions to this problem that didn't involve taking my car, but I could already feel the familiar weight of expectation settling over the table, the unspoken rules of our family dynamic asserting themselves like gravity, and I knew that if I protested, I'd be the selfish one, the difficult one, the daughter who cared more about material possessions than family. The pattern had been there my entire life, woven so deeply into the fabric of our family that for years I hadn't even recognized it as abnormal. And sitting at that Sunday dinner table with my mother's demand hanging in the air, I felt the full weight of every single time I'd been expected to sacrifice, while Emma received everything she wanted without ever having to ask. When Emma turned 16, Mom gave her the Honda Accord she'd been driving, a 2015 model with only 30,000 miles on it, and I remembered watching from my bedroom window as they surprised her with it in the driveway, red bow on the hood like a commercial. Emma squealing with delight while Mom beamed with the satisfaction of giving her youngest daughter such a generous gift. I had turned 17 4 months later and asked about a car, and Mom had looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "You can buy your own, Sarah. You're responsible enough to save up." And so I'd worked 30 hours a week at a pizza delivery place while finishing my senior year, driving their car with the lighted sign on top, and scraped together $4,000 to buy a 2004 Honda Civic with 120,000 miles and a passenger door that was a different color from the rest of the car. College had been the same story written larger, with more money and higher stakes, and the same fundamental inequality dressed up as logic. Emma's tuition to state school had been paid in full, room and board included, Mom and Dad covering all 4 years without Emma having to contribute a single dollar or even apply for financial aid, while I'd been told during my own college application process that they couldn't afford to pay for me because you're smarter than Emma, you'll get scholarships, and besides, you can take out loans and pay them back with your good job. I had gotten scholarships, enough to cover about 40% of my costs, and I'd taken out $63,000 in student loans for the rest. Loans I'd been paying down for 6 years now, and would be paying for 4 more years at least, while Emma had graduated debt-free and moved back home immediately because she needed time to figure out what she wanted to do. The wedding 2 years ago had been the moment when I'd almost said something, almost confronted the inequity directly, instead of swallowing it down like I'd been trained to do since childhood. Emma's wedding to Michael had cost $30,000, paid for entirely by our parents, a June ceremony at a country club with 200 guests, and a live band and a dress that cost $3,000 alone, and I'd been in the bridal party wearing a lavender dress I'd had to buy myself, while watching Mom cry happy tears about giving her baby the wedding of her dreams. I'd gotten engaged 6 months before Emma, had been planning my own wedding when Emma suddenly got engaged too and scheduled her wedding for 3 months before mine, and when I'd asked Mom privately about help with costs, she'd actually laughed and said, "Sarah, you make good money. Just save up for it yourself." As if my marketing coordinator salary at the time had been anything close to enough to afford the kind of celebration they'd given Emma without question. "Emma needs reliable transportation for job interviews," Mom said, and I watched her reach for her wine glass with the same steady hand she'd used to distribute unfairness my entire life, her voice taking on that reasonable tone that made me feel crazy for objecting to anything she said. I set down my fork carefully, buying myself a moment to think, to push down the immediate response that wanted to burst out of me, and I heard myself say, "Emma can use your SUV, can't she?" Which seemed like such an obvious solution that I almost believed for a second that Mom would see the logic in it. "I need that one," Mom replied without missing a beat, as if she'd anticipated every argument I might make and prepared her responses in advance. "You can take the bus, Sarah. You live in the city. It's not like you need a car for your daily commute." The casual dismissal of my needs, my property, my autonomy felt like a slap, and I glanced at my father sitting at the head of the table, waiting for him to say something, to inject some reason into this conversation, but he kept his eyes on his plate and cut his meat into smaller and smaller pieces, as if the precise size of each bite required his complete attention. Dad never contradicted Mom, not in 28 years of my watching their dynamic, and I'd stopped expecting him to start standing up for me a long time ago, but some small stupid part of me still hoped each time that maybe this would be the moment he'd find his backbone. "I'll take really good care of it, Sarah, I promise," Emma said, and her voice had that sweet little sister quality that she could turn on like a faucet, the tone that had convinced our parents to give her everything she'd ever asked for. And I looked at her across the table and saw the manipulation so clearly now that I wondered how I'd ever fallen for it before. She didn't even want the car for transportation. She wanted it because it was beautiful, because it would make her look cool, because taking something from me had always been easy, and she'd never learned to hear the word no. I tried to hold on to my resolve, to remember that I'd spent 3 years rebuilding that Mustang, that it represented something deeper than transportation, and I said, "Mom, I put a lot of work into that car. It has personal value to me." But even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how weak they sounded, how easily they could be dismissed. "It's just a car," Mom said, and there it was, the phrase that reduced my effort and passion to nothing. "Family is more important than things. Don't be selfish, Sarah." The word hit me like it always did, like a weapon Mom had perfected through years of use, and I felt myself starting to fold under the weight of it, because being called selfish was the worst thing I could be in this family, the ultimate sin, the accusation that meant I'd failed at the only role they'd ever really valued me for. My phone buzzed in my lap and I glanced down to see a text from my brother Kyle. "Don't do it." Just those 3 words. And I realized he'd been sitting silently at the other end of the table watching this whole exchange, seeing what I was seeing, recognizing the trap that was closing around me. I looked up and caught his eye, and he gave me the smallest shake of his head, but the pressure around the table felt enormous. The expectations of a lifetime pushing down on me, and I felt myself reaching for the response that would make this easier, that would let me escape this conversation and deal with the consequences later. "I'll think about it," I said carefully. And I watched Mom's eyes narrow, because this wasn't the immediate yes she'd expected, wasn't the capitulation I'd always given before. "Emma needs it by next weekend," Mom said. And now her voice had an edge to it, a warning that I was approaching the boundary of acceptable resistance. "She has an interview in Milwaukee next Friday, and she can't show up in a car that isn't reliable." The timeline was an ultimatum disguised as logistics, a deadline meant to pressure me into compliance, and I felt the familiar weight of family obligations settling over my shoulders like a coat I'd worn so long I barely noticed it anymore. Monday arrived with the particular dread that comes from knowing you need to talk about something you've been turning over in your mind all night, and I texted Jessica at 8 in the morning asking if she could meet me for lunch, needing her perspective the way a drowning person needs a life raft. Jessica had been my best friend since sophomore year of college, one of those friendships that forms when two people recognize something fundamental in each other. And she'd gone on to become a corporate lawyer at a firm in the Loop while I'd built my marketing career. But we'd never lost the closeness we'd developed over late-night study sessions and shared frustrations about our families. She'd watched my family dynamic for 10 years now, had been there for every birthday they'd forgotten and every achievement they'd dismissed. And when we met at the Thai place halfway between our offices, she took one look at my face and said, "What did they do now?" I told her everything, the whole story spilling out of me in a rush of words and accumulated hurt, and I watched her expression move from concern to disbelief to pure fury on my behalf. "They want you to give Emma the Mustang?" she said, loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over. "The car you spent 3 years rebuilding? Are they out of their minds?" Jessica's anger felt validating in a way I hadn't expected, like someone finally confirming that yes, this was as unreasonable as it felt, and I found myself defending my family even as I knew I shouldn't. "Mom says it's just a car, that family should be more important," I said, and Jessica set down her fork with enough force that it clattered against her plate. "Sarah, do you remember when Emma asked you for $3,000 for rent 2 years ago?" she asked. And of course I remembered. It had been right after Emma's wedding, and Emma had called me crying about how she and Michael were behind on bills and might get evicted. I'd transferred the money the same day, worried sick about my little sister being homeless, and then 3 weeks later, Emma had posted photos from Cancun, a surprise trip Michael had planned, and when I'd asked about it, she'd said, "Oh, Michael's parents gave us money for that, totally separate thing." The $3,000 had never been repaid despite multiple promises, and eventually I'd stopped asking because it was clear I'd never see it again. "And your graduation money from your grandparents," Jessica continued, "the $500 your mom borrowed for Emma's prom dress and never paid back?" That memory stung even years later, my grandmother pressing the card into my hand at my high school graduation and whispering, "This is for you, sweetheart, something special." And I'd been planning to use it for textbooks until Mom had come to me 2 weeks later with her hand out. Jessica leaned forward, her lawyer face on, the one she used when she was building a case. "You need to set a boundary here. This is your line in the sand, Sarah. If you give in on this, they'll never stop taking from you." I felt my throat tighten, because she was naming the fear I'd been carrying since childhood, the terror that if I ever said no, if I ever stopped being useful and compliant and willing to sacrifice, they would cut me off completely. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "If I don't give Emma the car, Mom will make me the villain. I'll lose my family." Jessica reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her grip firm and grounding. "Sarah, listen to me. They're already cutting you out. They just keep you around to use you. When was the last time your mom called just to see how you were doing? When did they last celebrate one of your achievements?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't remember a single time in recent memory when my parents had initiated contact for any reason other than asking for something or telling me about Emma's latest drama. Your grandmother wouldn't want you to be a doormat, Jessica said, and the mention of Grandma hit me right in the chest because she'd been the only family member who'd ever really seen me, who'd celebrated my report cards and asked about my dreams, and left me her jewelry when she died 3 years ago. And Mom had been furious about that too, had said it should be divided equally, even though the will had been explicit. I remembered Grandma's voice from the last conversation we'd had before the cancer took her, sitting in her hospital room while she held my hand with her paper-thin fingers and said, "You're the strong one, Sarah. That's why they lean on you. But don't let them mistake your strength for a doormat." And sitting there in that Thai restaurant with Jessica watching me with concern and confidence in equal measure, I felt something crystallize in my chest, a clarity I hadn't possessed the night before. I would give Emma keys to a car, just not the Mustang. Because I did own a second vehicle, one Mom didn't know about, and the plan forming in my mind felt like the first real boundary I'd ever considered drawing with my family. The secret I'd been carrying for 6 months suddenly felt like the solution to an impossible problem. And that evening after my lunch with Jessica, I sat in my apartment staring at the title document I kept in my filing cabinet, the one that proved I owned a second vehicle my mother knew nothing about. When Grandma's estate had finally cleared probate 6 months earlier, I'd received $45,000 after taxes, money she'd left specifically to me in a will that couldn't have been more explicit, and I could still remember Mom's face when the lawyer had read that portion aloud, the way her mouth had tightened into a line as she'd said, "I think it would be fair to split that with Emma, don't you, Sarah? Your grandmother would have wanted both her granddaughters taken care of." But Grandma had been crystal clear in her wishes, had even included a clause that said the money was to go to me alone and was not to be considered part of any family distribution, and for once, I'd had the legal backing to say no, though it had cost me 3 weeks of Mom's silent treatment and countless accusations of being greedy. I'd used $18,000 of that inheritance to buy a 2008 Toyota Camry from Mrs. Chen, one of my clients at Morrison Marketing whose grandmother had gone into assisted living and needed to sell her car quickly, and at the time I'd thought of it as an investment, a project car I could fix up and either flip for profit or donate for the tax write-off. The Camry had 180,000 miles on it, a check engine light that had been on for who knows how long, a transmission that shifted roughly enough to jar your teeth, cosmetic damage on 3 of the 4 doors, and an air conditioning system that had given up sometime during the Bush administration. Mrs. Chen had been apologetic about the condition, had offered to lower the price even further, but I'd paid her the $18,000 we'd agreed on because I knew she needed it, and because I genuinely intended to put another $4,000 into repairs and make it roadworthy. 6 months later, the Camry sat in a storage garage across town gathering dust while I drove my beloved Mustang, and I'd been planning to get around to those repairs eventually, maybe next spring when work slowed down. The car ran, technically, though it took several tries to start and made concerning noises once it did, but it was registered in my name. It had current plates, and it met the exact definition of what my mother had demanded: a car for Emma to use. I called the storage facility that evening and confirmed with the attendant that yes, the silver Camry in Unit 47 still started. He'd seen me drive it in 6 months ago, and it should still run. And then I drove over after work on Tuesday to test it myself. The car started on the third try, sputtering to life with a sound like a coffee grinder full of rocks, and the check engine light glowed cheerfully on the dashboard as I pulled it out of the storage unit and drove it around the block, feeling every rough shift of the transmission and hearing every concerning rattle from the engine bay. But it moved, it steered, it stopped when I hit the brakes, and it was mine to give away. And I sat in that parking lot with my phone out taking photos of everything. The title with my name on it, the maintenance records showing exactly what issues the car had, the current odometer reading, the check engine light, all of it documented with timestamps and GPS data embedded in the image files. I wasn't being deceptive, I told myself as I locked the Camry back in its storage unit and returned to my own car. I was setting a boundary, giving Emma exactly what she'd asked for, a car for transportation, and if my family had assumed I meant the Mustang, that was their assumption, not my promise. The Mustang had never been on the table, would never be on the table, and this solution let me technically comply with Mom's demand while protecting what was mine. It felt like the first genuinely clever thing I'd done in my relationship with my family, the first time I'd found a way to say both yes and no simultaneously. And driving home that night, I felt something unfamiliar rising in my chest that I eventually recognized as hope. Friday evening arrived with the weight of finality, and I called the storage facility to let them know I'd be taking the Camry out, then drove across town in my Mustang to pick it up, feeling like I was suiting up for battle as I transferred the title from my filing folder to my purse, along with the maintenance records I'd printed out. The Camry started on the second try this time, which felt almost lucky, and I pulled out of the storage unit with my heart hammering against my ribs as I pointed the sputtering car toward Naperville and my parents' house. The drive was 45 minutes of mechanical anxiety, the car stalling once at a red light in Oak Park, where I had to restart it while the driver behind me honked impatiently, and then again on the highway where I briefly thought I might die as I coasted onto the shoulder and turned the key until the engine caught and roared back to reluctant life. The temperature gauge climbed steadily toward the red zone. The transmission jerked with every shift, and a new rattling sound emerged from somewhere under the hood around Lyle that made me wonder if I'd even make it to my parents' driveway. But I did, pulling onto their quiet suburban street at 6:15 and parking deliberately at the curb rather than in the driveway because some instinct told me I might need a quick exit. Mom, Dad, and Emma were waiting in the living room when I walked in, the scene staged like an intervention, and Emma jumped up from the couch with an excitement that made my stomach turn as she said, "I can't wait to drive the Mustang. I already found a car meet in Schaumburg next weekend I want to take it to, and there's this great photo spot by the lake where everyone takes pictures with their classic cars." The presumption in her voice, the casual certainty that my car was now hers to plan around, sent a wave of rage through me so intense I had to pause and breathe before I could speak, and Mom was looking toward the window saying, "Where is it? I don't see it outside. Did you park in back?" I kept my voice absolutely level, calm in a way I'd practiced in my head all week, and said, "It's right there, the silver Camry at the curb," and pointed through the front window at the sad, dented sedan sitting under the streetlight, like evidence of everything I was about to do. The confusion on their faces would have been comical if my heart wasn't racing so hard I could feel my pulse in my throat, and Emma said, "That's not the Mustang," with a nervous laugh like I'd made a joke she didn't understand. "You asked for a car," I said, walking to the coffee table and setting down the keys and the title with deliberate precision. "That's my car. Here are the keys." Mom's face went from confused to red in about 3 seconds flat, that particular shade of anger I'd been terrified of my entire childhood, and she said, "Don't play games, Sarah. You know we meant the Mustang," and I felt something solid and unmovable settle in my chest as I said, "You said Emma needed a car for transportation. This is a car. It runs, it's registered, it's insured through the end of next month." Emma's eyes were filling with tears, that manipulation tactic I'd seen deployed 1,000 times whenever she didn't get what she wanted, and she said, "That's not the Mustang again," her voice breaking on the last word. And Dad finally spoke from his chair by the fireplace, his tone weary and disappointed as he said, "Sarah, be reasonable," which felt like being reasonable had only ever meant giving up what was mine. "I am being reasonable," I said, and my voice didn't shake even though my hands were trembling at my sides. "The Mustang is not available. This car is." Mom's full fury unleashed like a storm that had been building for years, and she stood up from the couch with her face that particular shade of red that used to send me running to my room as a child, her voice rising to a pitch I hadn't heard since I was 17 and came home 2 hours past curfew. That piece of junk? You expect your sister to drive that? She said, gesturing toward the window, as if the Camry outside had personally insulted her, and I kept my voice level and calm, in a way that felt like armor, as I said, "It runs, it's registered, and it's insured through the end of next month, which is more than enough time for Emma to get her own insurance policy set up." Emma had progressed from tears to full sobbing now, that theatrical crying she'd perfected somewhere around age 12, and she looked at me with her mascara starting to run as she said, "This is so typical of you, Sarah. You're so selfish. You've always been selfish." And the accusations started flying from both of them, like they'd been stored up and waiting for exactly this moment. I was bitter, I was jealous, I was cruel, I was ungrateful. I had always been difficult. I had always made everything harder than it needed to be, and Mom brought up everything she could think of as evidence of my fundamental wrongness, saying, "After all we've done for you, after we raised you and fed you and gave you a home, this is how you repay us?" And I found myself mentally cataloging what they'd actually done. The baseline legal requirements of keeping a child alive, nothing extra, nothing special, while Emma had gotten everything she'd ever asked for, and then some. The front door opened, and Kyle walked in right on time because I'd texted him 40 minutes earlier, asking him to show up at 6:30, and he took in the scene with quick understanding, Mom standing and red-faced, Emma crying on the couch, Dad looking uncomfortable in his chair, and me standing by the coffee table with my purse still on my shoulder. And Kyle said to Mom, "She's giving Emma a car, what's the problem?" with a reasonableness that made Mom round on him immediately. "Stay out of this, Kyle. This doesn't concern you," she snapped. But he stayed put in the doorway, and I felt a surge of gratitude for my little brother that made my throat tight as I said, "The Mustang has sentimental value. I rebuilt it myself over 3 years. Every weekend, every evening, I had free, and it represents something personal to me that I'm not willing to give up." Emma's voice was sharp through her tears as she said, "So what? I'm your sister. That should matter more than some car." And I looked at her directly for the first time since I'd walked in and said, "If it mattered to you, if I mattered to you, you wouldn't ask me to give up something so personal. You'd understand why I can't." Mom's ultimatum came like I knew it would, had been bracing for since I'd made this plan, and she said, "If you don't give Emma the Mustang, don't bother coming to Thanksgiving." And the threat hung in the air like smoke, the thing I'd feared my entire life, being cut off from the family, being excluded from holidays, being officially labeled as the problem, the difficult one, the one who didn't belong. The moment stretched out, and I felt time slow down as I made the choice I'd been moving toward for 6 months, maybe for 6 years, maybe for my whole life, and I stood up straighter and said, "Then I guess I won't be at Thanksgiving," and reached down to pick up the Camry keys and title from the coffee table where I'd set them down. The shock in the room was physical. I could feel it pressing against me from all sides, because I had never defied Mom before, had never chosen myself over family peace, and I walked toward the door where Kyle still stood as Mom said, "Sarah, don't you dare walk out of here. We're not finished." But I was finished, completely and entirely finished, and I walked past Kyle and out into the October evening air that felt like freedom. Kyle followed me out to where the Camry sat wheezing at the curb, the streetlight casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. And as soon as we were out of earshot of the house, he said, "I'm proud of you. That took guts." And I realized I was shaking so hard I had to lean against the car's dented door to stay upright. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation suddenly draining out of me and leaving my legs weak and my hands trembling as I tried to get my keys out of my purse. Kyle put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm tired of it too, the way they treat you. I've been watching it my whole life, and I'm done pretending it's normal." And I looked at my little brother, who wasn't so little anymore, 23 years old, and finally seeing the family dynamics clearly, and he told me he'd been secretly saving money to move out, that he had almost $8,000 in an account Mom didn't know about, and he was planning to get his own place by spring. "When you're ready, I'll help you," I said, and meant it completely. thinking about my second bedroom that barely got used, thinking about how good it would be to have an ally in this. And we hugged there on the sidewalk while the Camry's engine ticked as it cooled, and the lights in my parents' living room window threw yellow rectangles across the lawn. Kyle went back inside because he still lived there and had to face whatever came next, and I drove the sputtering Camry home with my phone buzzing constantly in my purse, making it back to my Lincoln Park apartment by 8:30 and finally checking my messages to find 47 texts from Mom that had come in over the course of the hour-long drive. They progressed like stages of grief, starting with pure anger, messages in all caps about my disrespect and my cruelty, then shifting to guilt-tripping about everything she'd sacrificed for me, how she'd been in labor with me for 19 hours, how she'd given up her career to raise us, how this was the thanks she got for everything, then escalating to threats about cutting me off completely and making sure the whole family knew what I'd done, and finally dissolving into playing the victim, saying I was tearing the family apart, that she didn't deserve this treatment, that she was having chest pains from the stress I was causing. Emma had sent 12 messages of her own, more crying and manipulation about how hurt she was, how she couldn't believe her own sister would betray her like this. And Dad had sent exactly one text that said, "Please apologize to your mother," with no acknowledgement of anything else that had happened. I didn't respond to any of them, just set my phone on the kitchen counter and called Jessica. And when she answered, I said, "I did it. I said no." And she actually screamed with joy, so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear, as she celebrated like I'd won something instead of just refusing to lose myself. We talked for an hour while I paced my apartment, Jessica proud and supportive, while I felt terrified and liberated and guilty and proud all at once. A cocktail of emotions that left me exhausted but unable to sleep, lying in bed at midnight staring at the ceiling and questioning if I'd done the right thing, if I'd just destroyed my family over a car, until I remembered grandmother's voice from years ago telling me that strong women make hard choices and that being strong doesn't mean never being scared, it means being scared and doing what's right anyway. The next 2 weeks felt like living in the aftermath of a natural disaster where the ground kept shifting under my feet. And Mom launched what I can only describe as a family-wide narrative campaign that spread through our extended family like wildfire, reaching cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, and aunts who suddenly had opinions about my character. My cousin Michelle texted me on a Wednesday afternoon saying, "I heard about the car situation. That's really harsh, Sarah. Emma is really hurting." And I stared at that message, knowing Michelle had only heard Mom's version, where I was the villain who'd cruelly denied my struggling sister basic transportation. Two of Mom's sisters called me within days of each other, Aunt Carol and Aunt Diane, both with the same script about how my mother was heartbroken and couldn't understand how I could be so cold. And I tried to explain my side to Aunt Carol, but could hear in her voice that she'd already decided I was wrong before she'd even dialed my number. The Facebook posts were worse because they were public and performative, Mom posting vague statements about the pain of ungrateful children and when you sacrifice everything and it's thrown back in your face. Never tagging me but making sure everyone knew exactly who she meant. And Emma joined in with selfies captioned, "When your own family betrays you," and learning who really has your back. Her comments full of supportive messages from relatives who had no idea what had actually happened. My reputation in the extended family took a hit I could feel even from a distance. Relatives who'd known me my whole life now viewing me through the lens of Mom's narrative. And I felt the weight of being misunderstood by people I'd grown up with. People who'd watched me graduate and get my first job, and believed I'd turned into someone cruel over a car. Then Uncle Tom called, Dad's younger brother, who'd always been the reasonable one, and he said, "Sarah, I want to hear your side of this before I form an opinion." And I almost cried at someone actually asking for my perspective instead of assuming Mom's version was complete truth. I told him everything over the phone, the years of favoritism, the pattern of sacrifice, the Mustang's personal significance, the Camry I'd actually offered, and Uncle Tom was quiet for a moment before he said, "That's what I figured. Your mom did the same thing to your dad's sister years ago." And suddenly a piece of family history clicked into place. Aunt Linda, Dad's sister, had been low contact with the family for almost a decade, showing up only to major events and keeping conversations surface level. And I'd always wondered why, but now understood she'd probably set a boundary that Mom couldn't forgive. Uncle Tom told me, "Don't let them rewrite history. Sarah, document everything, because your mom is very good at making herself the victim." And I started keeping careful records that night. Screenshots of every text message, a written timeline of events with dates and details, building a case I hoped I'd never need but felt safer having. Work became my refuge in a way it hadn't been before, and I threw myself into the campaign for a major client, a tech startup looking to rebrand and expand their market presence. Morrison Marketing pitching for a $2 million account that would be the biggest win of the year. I was lead strategist on the pitch, responsible for the overall vision and presentation, and my boss, Robert, noticed the stress I was carrying, but also watched me perform flawlessly through every meeting and revision, my professional competence unshaken even as my personal life crumbled. The pitch meeting happened on a Friday in mid-November, and I presented our strategy to 5 executives in their downtown office. And by the end of the 2-hour presentation, I could see in their faces that we'd won them over. The CEO specifically complimenting my insights into their target demographic and asking questions that showed he trusted my expertise. Thanksgiving Thursday arrived with unseasonable warmth for late November in Chicago, the temperature reaching 52 degrees by the time I woke up at 8 in the morning, and I lay in my Lincoln Park apartment completely alone for the first time on a major holiday in my 28 years, staring at the ceiling and feeling the grief of it settle over me like a physical weight, even though I knew I'd made the right choice, that defending my boundaries had been necessary and healthy and long overdue. Jessica had invited me to her family's Thanksgiving in Evanston, her parents hosting at their house with her 2 brothers and their families, and I'd accepted gratefully because the thought of spending the day entirely alone felt too sad to contemplate. But getting ready that morning, I felt the loss acutely as I scrolled through Facebook and saw the photos already being posted from my parents' house in Naperville. Emma had posted a picture at 9:45. The whole family gathered in the living room with Mom's good china visible in the background, everyone smiling at the camera. And the caption read, "Thankful for family who shows up," with 3 heart emojis, and I stared at those 4 words, knowing they were aimed directly at me, a public declaration that I'd failed some test of loyalty by refusing to be used. I almost broke in that moment, sitting on the edge of my bed in the sweater dress I'd chosen for Jessica's family gathering, my thumb hovering over my phone as I composed and deleted 3 different apology texts to Mom, the conditioning of 28 years pulling at me to just give in and make peace and accept whatever treatment came my way if it meant being included. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Kyle, and when I opened it, I found a photo he'd taken from the hallway, looking into my parents' kitchen where Mom and Emma stood facing each other with obvious tension in their postures. Emma's arms crossed, and Mom's finger pointed at her chest, and Kyle's caption said, "Not as perfect as Instagram suggests," with a laughing emoji. He followed it immediately with another message that said, "Emma showed up in Mom's car, never even went to that Milwaukee interview. It was a lie. She just wanted the Mustang to look cool and take photos with it. And now Mom is furious because she realizes you were right, but she'll never admit it." I read those words 3 times, feeling vindication wash through me like cold water. The confirmation that my instincts had been correct all along, that Emma's supposed job interview had been a manipulation, and Mom had been complicit in trying to guilt me into giving up something precious for no reason except Emma's vanity. I drove to Evanston at noon and walked into Jessica's parents' house to find genuine warmth and welcome. Her mom, Margaret, hugging me at the door and saying, "We're so glad you're here, Sarah. Jessica has told us so much about you." And the contrast between this authentic kindness and the obligatory tolerance I'd always felt at my own family gatherings hit me hard enough that I had to blink back tears. Jessica's family asked about my career with real interest, celebrating when I told them about the promotion and the new account. Her dad asking intelligent questions about marketing strategy that showed he actually cared about understanding what I did. And by the time we sat down to dinner at 3 o'clock, I felt something loosening in my chest that I hadn't even known was tight. The realization that family feeling was supposed to be built on mutual respect and genuine interest rather than hierarchy and obligation. By the time I drove home that evening at 8:30, full of Margaret's excellent turkey and Donald's famous bourbon pie, I felt sad but certain, grieving what I'd lost, but confident I'd made the only choice that allowed me to keep my self-respect. Monday morning after Thanksgiving, I arrived at Morrison Marketing at 8:15 to find an email from my boss Robert, waiting in my inbox with the subject line, "Meeting at 9 a.m., my office." And I spent 45 minutes trying to focus on routine tasks while wondering if the email meant good news or some problem I hadn't anticipated, my mind cycling through possibilities until Robert's assistant knocked on my cubicle wall at 8:57 to tell me he was ready for me. I walked into Robert's corner office with the view of the Chicago River, and he stood up from behind his desk with a smile that immediately eased my anxiety, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from him as he said, "Sarah, we got the account. The contracts were signed Friday afternoon, and the client specifically requested you as lead on the project." The words took a moment to register fully, and then the magnitude of it hit me all at once. A $2 million account that would be the biggest win Morrison Marketing had secured all year, my strategy and presentation having convinced executives to trust us with their entire rebrand and market expansion. And I felt something release in my chest that had been held tight for weeks. Robert wasn't finished, though, and he leaned forward with his hands folded on the desk and said, "This kind of performance doesn't go unrecognized here, Sarah, and I'm offering you a promotion to Senior Marketing Director, effective January 1st, with a salary increase from $95,000 to $135,000, an office with a window on the 12th floor, and a team of 3 junior strategists who'll report directly to you." I felt tears prick at my eyes despite my best effort to maintain professional composure. 6 years of work at Morrison Marketing, suddenly validated in this single conversation. All the late nights and weekend strategy sessions and client presentations culminating in recognition that I was genuinely good at what I did. That my skills had measurable value regardless of whether my family acknowledged it. Robert said, "You're one of the best we have, Sarah. Don't let anyone tell you different." And I wondered if he somehow knew about the family situation, even though I'd never mentioned it at work, or if he just recognized that I needed to hear those specific words in that specific moment. I thanked him with a voice that shook slightly, accepted the promotion formally, and walked back to my cubicle in a daze before immediately calling Jessica, who screamed so loudly into the phone that I had to pull it away from my ear, and we made plans for a celebration lunch at the Italian place we both loved in River North. Then I called Kyle, who answered on the second ring, and when I told him about the promotion and the salary increase, he said, "That's amazing, Sarah. You've worked so hard for this." And then, after a pause, he asked, "Are you going to tell Mom and Dad?" The question hit me in a tender place, because I realized immediately that I wanted to tell them, wanted to share this achievement with my parents, and hear pride in their voices, still hoping on some level that they could celebrate my success, even after everything that had happened between us. That evening at 6:30, I called my father's cell phone instead of the house line, choosing the neutral option that wouldn't force me to speak to Mom first, and Dad answered on the fourth ring with a cautious, "Hello, Sarah," that told me he wasn't sure what to expect from my call. I kept my voice steady and said, "Dad, I wanted to let you know I got a promotion at work. I'm going to be Senior Marketing Director starting in January." And he responded, "That's good, honey," in a tone that was pleasant but not enthusiastic. And I waited for him to ask about the details or express genuine interest, but the silence stretched between us until I filled it by adding, "It comes with a significant raise, $40,000 more than I was making." Dad said, "Well, you always were good at your work. with the same mild approval he might use to acknowledge that I'd done well on a high school book report. And then he added, "Your mother is still very hurt, Sarah. This whole situation with the car has been very hard on her." And I felt the disappointment settle over me like a physical weight. The realization that even in this moment of professional triumph, my father couldn't offer congratulations without immediately pivoting to guilt about Mom's feelings. I said carefully, "I called to share good news, Dad. I'm sorry Mom is hurt, but I'm not sorry for my decision about the Mustang." And he sighed and said, "Sarah, just apologize and this can all go away. You're tearing the family apart over a car." And I felt something harden in my chest as I realized he would never understand that it had never been about the car itself, but about my right to say no to unreasonable demands. I said, "I have nothing to apologize for. I'm going to go now," and ended the call before he could respond, sitting in my living room with my phone in my hand, feeling sad and angry, and also strangely free. The expectation that my parents would celebrate my achievements finally dying after 28 years of hoping they might somehow transform into the supportive family I'd always wished I had, instead of remaining the people they actually were. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in mid-December, I was working at the small desk in my Lincoln Park apartment, organizing strategy documents for the rebranding campaign that would officially launch in January, when my phone rang with Mom's number displayed on the screen, and I stared at it for 3 rings before answering because this was the first time she'd called me directly since the confrontation in October, the first time she'd initiated contact rather than sending guilt-inducing text messages or recruiting other family members to pressure me. Her voice when I answered was carefully controlled with an artificial pleasantness that I recognized immediately as her attempting to sound reasonable while expecting complete capitulation, and she said, "Sarah, we need to discuss Christmas," without any greeting or acknowledgement of the weeks of silence between us. I kept my own voice calm and boundaried, practicing the techniques Jessica and I had discussed over multiple coffee conversations, and responded, "What about it?" without offering anything more, waiting to see what demand or ultimatum she'd present. Mom said, "This has gone on long enough. You'll apologize to Emma for hurting her feelings about the car situation. Come to Christmas dinner like normal, and we'll move past this unpleasantness and get back to being a family." And the assumption embedded in those words that I would simply comply, now that she'd decided enough time had passed, made something harden in my chest. I said, "I won't be apologizing, Mom. I gave Emma a car, which is exactly what you asked me to do." And she responded with exasperation creeping into her controlled tone. "You know that's not what we meant, Sarah. Don't be deliberately difficult." And I felt the familiar pull to just give in and make peace, warring with the newer, stronger knowledge that giving in would only reset the pattern and teach her that if she waited long enough, I'd always eventually surrender. I said, "Then you should have been clearer in your request. The Mustang was never an option and never will be." And Mom's voice hardened immediately as she dropped the pretense of pleasantness and said, "Then you're not welcome at Christmas. If you can't put family first, then there's no point in you being there." I'd been preparing for this ultimatum since Thanksgiving, had actually expected it sooner, and I said with a steadiness that surprised me, "I understand. I'll miss seeing everyone, but I respect your decision." And the silence on the other end of the line told me she'd expected me to panic or beg or negotiate, rather than simply accepting the consequence she'd threatened me with. Mom recovered quickly and said, "That's it? You're choosing a car over your family?" And I felt the clarity of my response even before I spoke it aloud, saying, "I'm choosing self-respect. There's a difference. And if you can't see that, then I don't know how to explain it to you." She played her final card with a voice that had shifted to righteous anger and said, "Your father is very disappointed in you, Sarah. We raised you better than this." And I responded, "Dad is capable of calling me himself if he wants to talk to me. You don't need to speak for him." And then she said something that 3 months earlier would have destroyed me, but now just made me sad for her, saying, "You've always been difficult, Sarah. I don't know where we went wrong with you. I heard myself respond with a truth I hadn't fully understood until that exact moment, saying, "You didn't go wrong with me, Mom. I just didn't turn out as compliant as you wanted, and I'm sorry that disappoints you, but I'm not sorry for who I am." And Mom sputtered on the other end of the line, clearly not accustomed to me standing firm and speaking my truth without apologizing for it. I said, "I love you, Mom, but I'm not doing this anymore. When you're ready to have a real relationship with me built on mutual respect, instead of obligation and guilt, I'm here." And I ended the call before she could respond, sitting in my apartment with my heart pounding, but my hands steady as I immediately called Kyle to warn him that Mom would likely be on the warpath and might try to use him as a weapon against me. Kyle answered on the first ring and said before I could explain, "I'm coming to you for Christmas, Sarah." I already decided, and I felt tears prick at my eyes because my little brother had apparently been planning his own Declaration of Independence. Christmas week arrived cold and crystalline with snow reflecting winter sunlight off the buildings of Lincoln Park, and I was making coffee in my apartment kitchen on the morning of December 22nd when someone knocked on my door at 8:30, and I opened it to find Kyle standing in the hallway with two large suitcases and a backpack with an expression on his face that was equal parts terrified and determined as he said, "I'm done, Sarah. I moved out." I pulled him inside immediately and wrapped him in a hug while he stood stiff for a moment before relaxing into it, and I said, "You're staying here as long as you need to. The second bedroom is yours." And he nodded against my shoulder before pulling back to roll his suitcases into my apartment while I closed the door behind him and watched my 23-year-old brother try to compose himself in my living room. Kyle sat on my couch and explained that after my phone call, warning him about Mom's likely reaction to my Christmas ultimatum, she had indeed cornered him the next evening and told him he needed to cut off contact with me, that he had to choose between supporting his ungrateful sister or remaining part of the family, and he'd realized in that moment that he couldn't keep living under her control and pretending that the way she treated both of us was normal or acceptable. He told me he'd been secretly saving money for 8 months, had $17,000 in an account Mom didn't know about from his job as an IT specialist at a healthcare company, and he'd spent the last 3 days quietly moving his important possessions to a storage unit before finally walking out that morning while Mom was at her book club and Dad was at work, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said simply, "I'm an adult and I'm moving out. I'll be in touch when I'm ready." I made Kyle breakfast while he unpacked his immediate necessities into the guest room, and over eggs and toast he revealed more family truth that I'd suspected but never had confirmed, telling me that Emma's divorce 18 months ago had actually been because she'd cheated on her husband repeatedly and he'd finally had enough. But Mom had paid for Emma's lawyer and spent months telling everyone in the family and the wider community that Emma's ex-husband had been controlling and emotionally abusive, despite that being completely false. Kyle said that Emma had never held a job longer than 4 months in her entire adult life, that she was 25 years old and had never once supported herself financially, that Mom had been paying her car insurance and credit card bills and giving her spending money throughout her entire marriage, and continued doing so now, and he looked at me with an expression of exhausted clarity and said, "You were the scapegoat, and Emma was the golden child, Sarah. It's textbook family dysfunction, and I can't believe it took me this long to really see it." I felt validation wash over me mixed with sadness for both of us. For the years we'd spent trying to earn love that was only ever given conditionally and unequally, and I reached across my small kitchen table to squeeze Kyle's hand and said, "We're going to be okay. We have each other, and that's more real than anything back in that house." And he nodded and squeezed back, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had actual family instead of just people who shared my DNA. Christmas Day arrived quietly in my apartment with Kyle already awake in the kitchen making coffee when I emerged from my bedroom at 9 in the morning, and we spent the day in comfortable companionship watching movies and cooking an impromptu dinner together while our phones remained notably silent from the family gathering happening without us in Naperville. And I felt surprisingly peaceful despite the weight of everything that had changed in the past 3 months since that October Sunday dinner when Mom had first demanded my Mustang. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Tom with a photo of him and his wife and their 2 teenage daughters around their own dinner table with the message, "Merry Christmas from the rebels who also skipped the drama." And I smiled and showed it to Kyle, who laughed and said that apparently we weren't the only ones who'd reached our limit with Mom's toxicity and control. That evening, after Kyle had gone to his room to video chat with some friends from his IT job, I sat in my living room looking at the small Christmas tree I'd bought and decorated by myself for the first time. And I thought about all the holidays I'd spent walking on eggshells and trying to earn approval that was never freely given, and sacrificing my own comfort to keep peace that was never really peaceful at all. And I realized that this quiet day with my brother had been more genuinely happy than the last 10 Christmases combined at my parents' house. My phone rang at 8:15, and I saw Dad's number and answered with curiosity about whether he was calling of his own accord or at Mom's instruction, and his voice was quiet and tired when he said, "Sarah, I wanted to call and say Merry Christmas," without the usual edge of guilt or expectation in his tone. I said Merry Christmas, Dad, and waited to see where he'd take the conversation, and he was silent for a long moment before saying, "Kyle's really gone. He left a note, but he won't return our calls." And I could hear something that might have been actual distress beneath his words, rather than just annoyance at disobedience. I made a decision in that moment to be honest, rather than protective, and said, "He's here with me, Dad. He's safe and he's okay. He just needed to get out of that house." And Dad said, "Your mother is beside herself, both of her children gone at Christmas." And I heard myself respond with a truth I'd never been brave enough to speak before, saying, "Dad, have you ever stopped to think about why both of your adult children chose to leave, rather than keep participating in the way this family operates?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Dad said something that surprised me, saying, "I know I should have stood up for you more, Sarah. I know I let your mother run things and I took the easy path." And his admission hung in the air between us, heavy with years of accumulated hurt and absence. I felt tears start to form, because this was the closest thing to an apology or acknowledgement I'd ever received from him. And I said, "Dad, it's not too late to have a real relationship with me and Kyle, but it has to be based on respect and treating us as adults with our own lives and boundaries." And he said quietly, "I'll think about what you said," before wishing me good night and ending the call. And I sat holding my phone, wondering if my father might actually be capable of change, or if this was just a momentary crack in the facade that would seal back up by morning. 3 months after Kyle moved in and found his own apartment just 4 blocks from mine in Lincoln Park, with financial help I was happy to provide as a security deposit loan, he'd already started paying back, despite my insistence he didn't need to. Spring arrived in Chicago with that particular quality of light that makes the whole city feel reborn after the brutal winter, and I was driving my Mustang down Lakeshore Drive on a Saturday morning in late March, with the windows down and music playing, when my phone rang through the car's speakers, showing Dad's number. I answered with caution, born of experience, and said, "Hi, Dad," while keeping my eyes on the road and the lake sparkling blue-gray to my right. And his voice came through sounding older and more hesitant than I remembered as he said, "Sarah, I was wondering if you might have time to meet me for coffee, just the two of us. I have some things I'd like to say to you." I felt my heart rate pick up with a mixture of hope and wariness, the old longing for my father's approval warring with the new understanding that I didn't need it to be whole. And I said, "I can do that. When were you thinking?" And we arranged to meet the next afternoon at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park that was neutral territory for both of us. Sunday at 2 o'clock, I walked into the coffee shop and found Dad already sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of him. And he stood when he saw me with an awkwardness that told me how far outside his comfort zone this meeting was. And I sat down across from him and wrapped my hands around the latte he'd ordered for me, made exactly the way I liked it, which meant he'd been paying attention all these years, even if he'd never shown it. Dad looked at me for a long moment before saying, "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Christmas, since Kyle left, and I realize I owe you an apology that's about 28 years overdue." And I felt tears start to form immediately, because I'd waited my entire life to hear my father say something like that, and had convinced myself it would never happen. He told me that he'd let Mom control the family dynamic because it was easier than standing up to her, that he'd watched her favor Emma and demand more from me, and he'd told himself it wasn't his place to interfere, that he'd failed me as a father by not protecting me from the inequality and the emotional manipulation and the constant expectation that I sacrifice myself for everyone else's comfort. I listened while tears ran down my face, and Dad's eyes got red and watery as he continued, saying, "Kyle told me everything about why you wouldn't give Emma the Mustang, about the Camry you actually offered, about the pattern of demands and sacrifices that I pretended not to see. And Sarah, you were right to set that boundary, and I'm ashamed that it took me this long to tell you so." I reached across the table and took his hand and said, "Dad, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to see me and treat me with respect as an adult, with my own life and my own right to make decisions." And he squeezed my hand and nodded and said, "I'd like to try to build a real relationship with you, separate from your mother, if you're willing to give me that chance." We sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours talking more honestly than we ever had in my entire childhood, and Dad told me he'd moved into the guest room at home and was considering separation, that watching both his children leave had finally made him examine his own unhappiness and complicity in a toxic system. And while I felt sad for the pain he was experiencing, I also felt hope for the first time that I might actually have a father who could be present and supportive in my life. When we finally parted with a long hug on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, Dad said, "I'm proud of you, Sarah. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of the woman you've become, despite not getting the support you deserved." And I drove home in my Mustang, feeling like something broken had finally started to heal.